Gort Show is sponsored by Ellipsis Labs. Ellipsis Labs is building a world where mainstream finance happens on-chain. Their first product, Phoenix, is a fully on-chain limit order book DEX on Solana, doing hundreds of millions of dollars in volume with 100% unincentivized users and liquidity. I know this team personally. They're one of the strongest teams you're going to find, and they happen to be hiring engineers right now. If you're passionate about DeFi and interested in building something sustainable in this space, visit ellipsislabs.xyz or find them on Twitter at ellipsis_labs. Hey guys, I'm here today with Alan Farrington. Alan Farrington is one of my favorite Bitcoiners on Twitter. I think he has a lot of knowledge in both traditional finance, and now he's moved into Bitcoin. I think some of you guys will recognize him, but Alan, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So my name's Alan Farrington. Yeah, you're right. People probably mostly know me for shitposting on Twitter. Now, though, something that I think you mentioned, you want to get into this maybe a bit later on, run a firm called Axiom, which is primarily doing VC in the Bitcoin space. We have slightly more, let's say, ambitious intentions in terms of other projects that we want to move on to, but for now, just VC.
Awesome. Okay, well, can you give I don't know, you don't have to go too far into, but give a brief elevator pitch as to how you got into Bitcoin and what were you doing before. I know you worked in traditional finance, but now you've sort of fully made the leap. If you want to just tell us what kind of brought you into Bitcoin and why you've decided to go full time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you set the question up that way, because I think that the second half of it is far more interesting in my case. My origin story, if you want to call it that, is just super boring, honestly, compared to many others that I have heard. I guess the stereotype is, there's always it's like a light bulb moment or whatever. There's something that happens to you that, changes the course of your life. It just didn't happen with me at all. It was an incredibly slow burn. It just over the course of, I don't even know, 6-7 years or something, I just got slowly more and more involved. I think the career transition is a lot more interesting though. So I worked in asset management for quite a large firm. And for most of the time that I was there, for all the time I was there, I was the resident token Bitcoiner. For most of the time, it just wasn't relevant to my job at all. What that company did is exclusively, in layman's terms, I don't want to get too deep in financial jargon, but just investing in other companies. So we couldn't invest in Bitcoin. That wasn't an option, which I think was really quite a helpful thing in terms of where my career ended up. Because if we could have, I probably would have just, written that report in 2015 or something, then just forgotten about it for 10 years and number goes up a lot and everybody's happy. And I mean, I guess it would have been good from the perspective of, it would have been an amazing investment if we made it then, but not being able to do that actually forced me into a much more, let's say, disciplined position where instead of just making that quite simple argument, I had to instead think about how or if maybe or when Bitcoin would actually start to affect companies that we had the opportunity to invest in. And for a very long time, it just didn't at all. It was too small. There weren't enough companies. For a long time, there weren't enough companies at all, at least in public markets. There then started to be some with miners and exchanges and so on. But even then, we had quite a high bar, also quite a specific investment philosophy that made them not really great candidates to care about all that much. And it was only in probably, I forget the exact timing, maybe 2020, 21, there finally were companies that was worth looking at. And this is why I say that this part of the question in my case is far more interesting, because I'd been on the job for 5-6 years at that point. And once I had the opportunity to start looking at Bitcoin companies, having found Bitcoin interesting and been involved personally for probably at that point, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, been involved in a more public facing capacity, completely separate from my job for 2 or 3 years. It was just a really interesting moment because, maybe not all these companies, but most of them I knew really just via Bitcoin Twitter, right? I knew them as a fan, maybe as a customer in some cases, if they were even consumer facing in the first place. But then actually finally having the chance to integrate that with what my real job was, which is investment analysis, I pretty much immediately realized, well, two things actually. One is that it's way more interesting, just given, my interest in the space in general. But also the timing was, I think, ideal in that part of the reason it even happened in the first place is that at that point, it seemed like there really were enough companies to actually merit doing this full time. The only difference was, though, it made no sense to do it full time at my previous employer. It was still far too small from their perspective. But it seemed like a perfect opportunity to branch out on my own. And that's basically where Axiom came from. Me and the co-founder of Axiom, Anders Larsen, who previously, some of your listeners might know him better actually as Big Al, who's the pseudonymous co-author of Only the Strong Survive. But he's since ditched that pseudonym. He goes by his real name now. He had a very similar experience, just his kind of path through TradFi, discovering this opportunity at actually the exact time that we were writing Only the Strong Survive. And that's where Axiom came from, basically sensing that we could finally make a full-time job out of this.
Yeah. To that end, Axiom is your venture fund now. Let me ask, like, when you were working at this public company, I'm not going to probe too much into that because I want to look at the future, but we are going to, I want to ask quickly, like, what did you see in terms of public company? Because like, this is something that I'm not super familiar with, but in terms of public company investment in like miners, is it basically just miners that you can look at from like that have the liquidity for like a large investment manager to get access to Bitcoin in that sense? Is that
honestly, right now, I don't really know because I haven't thought about it for a good 2 or 3 years. I assume that there are more, there just has to be more opportunities now. I mean, mining is the obvious one just because of how capital intensive that industry is. And hence, there's far bigger companies as a result of that. And many of them are now public. Just to flesh out what I meant before, though, it's in my previous role, we had a far more specific mandate than would be than most of the miners are really relevant to. So for a generic public equities investor, you'd have to have quite an informed opinion on mining, I would imagine. But the company that I worked for, which I'm not trying to be secretive, by the way, it's called Bailey Gifford. You can look them up. I'm still, I'm on very good terms with them. I have a very high opinion of them. They just had a very specific investment philosophy, which I don't know, we could go into this a little bit. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but I think lends itself quite nicely to understanding Bitcoin. It's that connection is a bit philosophical. Like I wouldn't want to oversell it, but they have, before I said something like they have a very high bar, it's really more like they're very specific in the kinds of things they want to invest in. They have very concentrated portfolios, at least relative to, other public equities investors of their size. And basically what they're looking for is the potential for extreme outliers in terms of, well, ultimately just growth, right? They're often characterized as just classic, almost extreme growth investors. What that really means in a bit more kind of technical detail is that the way you actually achieve that, right, rather than just some punt that goes spectacularly well, is trying to identify businesses that are radically new, either in terms of their technology or their business model, such that basically the rest of the market doesn't really appreciate them yet. So what Bailey Gifford's actually predominantly known for, I would imagine, I mean, at least outside, the intricacies of the industry, is it basically just comes down to Amazon and Tesla. They were very early investors in both and did spectacularly well in both. I know that obviously there's many other examples that they would like to, I don't mean for this to become like me doing Bailey Gifford's marketing.
No, but, you can do whatever you want. That's the good part. You can just ramble.
Well, I'd rather just do Axiom's marketing, but no, I mean, this is all just to say that I admire them, have a very good relationship with them still, but I think that their investment philosophy really rubbed off on me. Like I took it very seriously when I was there, and I probably convenient that I largely agreed with it. I think the spiciest thing I can say about it, this is the kind of maybe unhelpfully philosophical connection. I don't know how you really want to spend that much time on, but I think it would be reasonable to describe their investment philosophy as quite Austrian. like not exclusively, they certainly don't talk about it that way. You won't find the word Austrian in any of their materials, but if you understand, particularly in a kind of more of a Bitcoin-y context, and especially in a context of investing in companies in the Bitcoin space, exceptionally low time preference, maybe one good way of characterizing it. So yeah, I mean that whole philosophy that I spent 5-6 years internalizing before it was ever even relevant to Bitcoin, I think has actually ended up being super relevant to what I'm doing now.
Yeah, okay, that was a good explainer. Now, I didn't want people to not understand where you came from. So I think that was good information. So now we can move on to what you're doing now, which is Axiom. I don't know if you want to just explain it from like if you have like, it sounds very Silicon Valley, but if you have like a investment thesis, or if you have how would you describe Axiom and what you guys are trying to do now?
I mean, this maybe isn't the best marketing for myself, but it's really not that sexy at all. It's more, I guess, I mean, for your audience, most of this will just be completely straightforward. It's more when we go and talk to TradFi people that we're trying to get money from, it sounds like really, really sexy. But no, I mean, for a Bitcoiner audience, it's very simply that, there's a massive, almost arbitrage opportunity, I would say, in terms of the opportunity to deploy capital into early stage Bitcoin companies on the basis that, on the one hand, it's very similar to just tech, almost generalist VC, with the difference that most of these companies, in some or other way, I mean, there's different ways they can achieve this, but they're largely leveraged to Bitcoin's success, which is just like the most unbelievably attractive investment opportunity set you could ask for, provided you understand that in the first place, right? And I think that's what's interesting about it. And that's kind of what I meant before when I said that it's, when I originally saw this and realized there were actually enough opportunities to do this full time rather than just one-offs from a more generalist fund, that's basically what we're offering is, access to this highly unusual set of what's mostly just early stage tech startups, but where what we are offering is, expertise and connections and so on. And to a Bitcoiner audience, this is all just totally straightforward. It's like, well, of course, these companies are good investments. But yeah, like I said, to TradFi allocators, this is all like mind-blowing stuff.
Okay, I want to go back. I will need to give some context here. You are a prolific writer, I would say. I read all of your stuff. I only got through like 75% of Bitcoin is Venice. Is that what it's called? Bitcoin is Venice? I got through a good bit. Okay?
I'm not 100% convinced anybody has finished that book, so I don't blame you.
All right. Well, I've read a lot of your, I don't know, what do you call them? Blog posts or short essays. Okay. So I want to go back. You wrote a very, I thought, straightforward, cohesive argument. I don't know if argument's the word, piece on DeFi. And you pointed out a lot of what you thought were the issues with what we think of as DeFi, right? I think this is like the context was sort of crypto DeFi. So we can just start there. Like, what do you see as the issues with DeFi? And then we can sort of move into the Bitcoin angle. But we'll just start with like, what's wrong with the traditional financial system, and then what's wrong with DeFi?
Well, yeah.
Okay, so maybe scratch that first part.
No. It's a good setup, actually, because I think this might be one of my more, I don't know if contrarian is the right word. I think a lot of your audience won't really like this answer, but
perfect.
I would encourage them to take it seriously anyway, that I don't think there is a huge amount wrong with traditional finance. I think there's a huge amount wrong with fiat money, and that it perverts a lot of the incentives with traditional finance. But I mean, this has always been my issue with DeFi, that I feel like my objection to it is maybe it's almost like, this is completely on course for me, by the way. This is like exactly the kind of stupid shit that I would come out with in answer to anything. Is like far more philosophical than you were probably intending for me to go for. But that basically a huge amount of, I'd say maybe more the narrative around DeFi, not even really DeFi itself, is like this bizarre category error in terms of it sounding really cool and really sexy that decentralizing finance ought to be a noble goal, or ought to even be a possible goal, when I'm honestly not sure what it even means in most of the potential applications that people get excited about. And I think I can try to like drill down into this a little bit. So I think if you're understanding what, like trying to be really rigorous about understanding what finance even is, I think teases or helps you tease out why a lot of the enthusiasm is so misguided. So finance is, I think there's basically two things you want to keep in mind. So it's on the one hand, it's capital allocation, but I think it's capital allocation that has been professionalized into its own standalone industry. And these are somewhat discrete things. So first of all, in capital allocation, almost all capital allocation, I mean, even in theory, never mind in practice, it just requires judgment, right? It's essentially entrepreneurial, and it definitionally cannot be automated. And I think that gets rid of like, if you've properly understood that gets rid of like 90% of the enthusiasm for DeFi. The whole part about it being professionalized into an industry, I think you can get a bit more kind of fruitful insights around what, if anything, ought to be done there. So I think some aspects of the plumbing, if you want to think of it that way, potentially could be automated, right? So things like whether it's securities registries and then securities tokens is the obvious thing, or market making and then automated market makers, obvious thing. There's maybe even some capital allocation decisions that are very low or like zero parameters. So things like one thing I do actually think is super interesting is over collateralized loans, right? Especially where you can also automate the liquidations, and you're basically removing any actual judgment, even while you're facilitating, useful allocation of capital. But I think the thing is that these are very much exceptions, right? They're not the general rule. And I think that acting as if they are the rule and then extrapolating that to like being all gung-ho on DAOs, for example, which I think are just completely absurd as a concept. I think that's kind of the essence of basically of seeing blockchain as blockchain for the audio. Sorry, I'm doing I'm doing inverted commas, blockchain. Seeing blockchain as a hammer for which every non-problem in finance is a nail that you have to go and hit with this. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a kind of philosophical lens that I think is useful to basically just kind of calm down about a lot of this stuff. And actually, there's even one more thing that I think is worth saying, that even if you admit that some or other aspect of finance could or should be like automated or disintermediated or whatever you want, I don't think even then that's a good enough reason to want to jump to, again, blockchain being the way to do it. Like, even if you can do it that way, whatever it is you're talking about, that still doesn't mean that it's like necessarily better or that it's a good idea. Right. And I think this is a good point to end on, actually, that whenever I'm thinking about this or talking about this, I inevitably, having complained about everything first, I always go back to this great tweet from Bitstein. I forget the exact phrasing. I haven't actually memorized it properly, but what he's basically pointing out is that saving is the fundamental building block, not only of finance, but just of all capital accumulation. And actually, fiat prevents or maybe even prohibits appropriately decentralized saving. So Bitcoin's mere existence is probably like 90% plus of the DeFi you'll ever need. I think, actually, I don't want to speak for him, but Bitstein himself would probably say it's 100%. I'm kind of like, I'm a bit more, bullshit curious than he is. But it's certainly no less than 90.
Yeah, I think that you bring up a good point, which is something that Bitcoiners certainly ascribe to. And then I think those of us who are, you say bullshit curious. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly where I put myself. Like, I certainly spend way too much time looking at this stuff. But I mean, I think there is a difference between agreeing that the traditional financial system has these antiquated rails, right? And there's things that don't function efficiently, and capital isn't being allocated as efficiently or properly as it should be, versus saying the obvious solution to that is a blockchain, right? And I think that's like where that's sort of like the chasm. And I think like this has long been like the criticism of a lot of crypto. And I mean, there's a lot of like first principles, right, in crypto that a lot of us are like, I'm not sure about that. Like, I don't even know that every asset in the world needs to be on like a shared ledger. You know what I mean? This is like heresy saying
totally
this,
not. No.
but it's like I mean, I could maybe be convinced at some point, but I'm not like certain of it. But this is like, I think this is what's interesting too, is like you sort of have to ascribe to some of these like first principles thinkings to agree on then the usefulness of the rest of this stuff. And if you don't necessarily agree on these like, oh, everything needs to be on a blockchain, or like this is certainly the most efficient way to allocate capital, then it's hard to have like a conversation thereafter. So yeah, I mean, it is like, I think you're spot on about that. So I want to ask you then, like now you're investing in Bitcoin applications, Bitcoin products. Like, what are you looking at? Like, what is Axiom looking at and saying, okay, this is useful and this is something that like we believe in and are going to put money behind?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful in exactly how I answer this, just because I don't want to give the impression that basically that I or that we, really know this at all. I think our decision making, you could almost think of it kind of runs in the other direction, right? We don't go out and look for something that fits XYZ profile. We see what's out there in the first place, what has come to us, what needs capital, and form our theses retrospectively around those opportunities, because the people who are actually building this stuff, both technology and businesses, more importantly, that's maybe a distinction that's worth diving into in a second, actually. They're the ones who actually know, right? They're the real experts. Our expertise is not at all in like LARPing that we're developers. It's in figuring out how to appropriately and relatively prudently allocate capital to them. So yeah, I think that's an important disclaimer, that basically like nobody should take what I think about this particularly seriously or at all seriously. I can only describe what we have actually seen and what we've actually invested in. I think I'm trying to think of the best way to go through this, because there are some sensitivities about, describing exactly what our portfolio looks like, because it's not, public, obviously. But I can still be relatively open about it, I guess. At this stage, Lightning is pretty heavily represented, which probably makes some sense, just given of all the, if you want to think of them as like sub-industries within Bitcoin, I think it's by far the oldest, the most developed. There's the best tooling around it. There's the best, or probably one of the things that we're actually particularly excited about is that it's getting easier and easier to start new Lightning companies in the first place, because of the amount of B2B Lightning services that you can kind of just plug in from day one. And if anything, given that our remit for everything, not just for Lightning, but our remit is very loosely defined infrastructure in the Bitcoin space, it's those kinds of companies that we're particularly attracted to. So I think probably something like Voltage is the perfect example of this. And yeah, I mean, it's fine disclosing that we're, individual investments we made. I mean, we've done a podcast with Graham where we talk about this extensively, so that's fine. But yeah, so probably most of them, well, not most of them, I don't know, over half, let's say, have a Lightning component. The other thing to say there, though, is that even though Lightning is very heavily represented, one of the things that I think is quite exciting about that is that probably most of the individual companies, it's not all that helpful to describe them as Lightning companies, which I think is exciting in and of itself. I mean, it shows, I don't want to say, we're obviously this is like permanently valid cliche that we're still early. So I'm not saying oh, we're, not saying that, that like we're done, like Lightning has won, it's over. That's not the point I'm getting at all, but that it's encouraging in terms of the development of even the opportunity set of what we can invest in, that there are companies that are simply using Lightning to do something just completely different. I think maybe like Thunder's kind of a cool example of that, where, you can call them a Lightning company if you want, but probably calling them like a gaming company, or even what they're moving into now with Clinch, like a wagering company. That's far cooler.
Sorry to interrupt. They have one of these games that I got like extremely addicted to. This like
that's the whole thesis.
Tetris. I downloaded this to like, I think you shilled it. This. Oh,
probably, yeah.
You're shilling your bags, and I downloaded this, and it was one of those games like, it was like the new like Flappy Birds or whatever it's called, Angry Birds. Like I just got like clinically addicted to this game. But yeah, that's certainly more of a gaming company. But sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
Go
yeah,
on.
exactly.
I didn't know.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that because I haven't even graduated onto that. I'm still addicted to solitaire. It's like more than a year now. But yeah, I mean, not to pick on Thunder specifically, but I think what that's representative of is really interesting in that there are companies that are, and there's quite a lot of them. I can go through some others that do, completely different things. Maybe like Sonota's super interesting example. Obviously nothing whatsoever to do with Thunder other than they use Lightning in the back end, but they're maybe even more of an energy company for the sake of argument. But the point I'm getting at is that what this trend seems to represent, even aside from us having invested in these companies, like the fact they even exist, right? The fact they're there to be invested in does show, I think, at least some signs of maybe not maturity, but maturing in Lightning, that it can go more and more into the background and just be a piece of tech that these companies are using. And that's a super interesting point that I think goes well beyond, just what we're doing. It's probably reflective of, let's say, progress in Bitcoin just as a whole. It's certainly nothing to do with Lightning specifically. That, we talk about this a lot internally, and we have it's kind of like some of it's just in joke, some of it's, painfully trying not to be a cliche in terms of how we communicate it. Like if we're trying to market ourselves to potential LPs, that the comparison to the early consumer web, let's say, is like definitely a cliche in terms of Bitcoin adoption. But there's a particular angle on it that I do actually find relatively insightful, at least insofar as it applies to precisely what we're doing. That if you were a VC or if you were just any kind of investor in the early to mid 90s and you described what you were doing as internet investing, right, that would actually have been helpful, right? It would have been useful to communicate what differentiates you from some other kind of investor. But if you fast forward even, I'd say probably like the mid noughties, but certainly now, saying you're an internet investor, it just means absolutely nothing. It's like, well, of course, like why would you, what even is a non-internet investor? Like the internet's everywhere, it's in everything. And we have it doesn't translate perfectly, but we have a similar thesis with Bitcoin that the more it matures, the more it gets normalized, the less relevant it's going to be to claim that we're Bitcoin investors, because more and more it's just going to be in the background, which is exactly why I like, Thunder or Sonota as examples, that it's just a tool for them, right? It's not, you can obviously talk up the properties of Lightning and get into how cool it is, but you don't really need to. Like you can talk about Thunder as a gaming company, you can talk about Sonota as an energy company, and you're doing fine. So I think the more we move in that direction, the more our own thesis will be playing out as essentially correct.
Yeah. So I want to ask you then, what have you thought of some of like the recent criticism of Lightning? I think that what you are talking about here is sort of what a lot of people are now coming to realize is probably the use case of Lightning. Maybe Thunder, not a perfect example, but like these B2B, like a B2B, what did I forget what Alex B called it, but he had a good terminology. It's like sort of the behind the scenes infrastructure layer for businesses, and maybe not the direct consumer application of payments or whatever you kind of want to think of as like decentralized finance again. So what are your thoughts on like moving beyond Lightning? Do you think the criticisms are valid? And like where else are you guys looking?
Oh yeah, sorry, I should get back to the whole reason I went on that tangent is that only some of what we're doing is Lightning, and there is other exciting stuff too. I'll come back to that, but I'll answer the Lightning question first. I more or less agree. I think I'd tweak the phrasing slightly though to get to the real heart of the matter. That I don't think there even are criticisms of Lightning per se. I think there are criticisms of the Lightning narrative, if you want to put it that way. I think what's being realized is that a lot of the narratives around Lightning have just kind of been bullshit, which is obviously unfortunate. But I'm also wary of my commentary on this coming across as like, oh, I knew this all along, and aren't we just swell in terms of how we've positioned ourselves. But if anything, I kind of feel like I've talked to loads of people about this privately who are certainly far more technically adept than I am. I won't like dox any of them, obviously, but people who've, I think in the past, whatever, like 6 months probably feels about right, have almost felt that it's now safe to be more open with what their concerns had always been about, but again, not about Lightning, about the narrative. So I think it's a good thing that the narrative is under attack insofar as it was never really accurate in the first place. As for, what, and just to be completely clear though, like this is why I'm distinguishing the narrative from the technology so much, is that still incredibly bullish on Lightning, just want to try to be more realistic about what it's for. I don't even think that my thoughts on, what it's for are going to be particularly insightful. I think if anything, it feels like it's where the narrative is now having to go in the first place. And what you mentioned from Alex sounds pretty much like what I would articulate as well. I think, as concisely as possible, it's just for businesses. It has UX problems that are very likely unsurmountable for the vast majority of regular users. Like, it's fine if you're a hardcore, but not even a hardcore Bitcoiner, but a hardcore, very technical Bitcoiner. It's fine to be like, to be like super militant about, running your own node, right? But most Bitcoiners don't even do that with Lightning, never mind with regular people, like hoping that this is going to catch on. So I think there's basically two likely outcomes. So one is that the vast majority of usage does go to businesses, or if it's consumers, it's probably going to be custodial Lightning, just because that fixes the UX problems for you. And you can get as mad as you want about the sovereignty trade-offs there, but I think the really important distinction to make is, I'm not saying this should be the case. There's a really important is-ought distinction here. I'm not saying this should be the case. If anything, I'm happy to say it shouldn't be the case, right? People should run their own Lightning nodes, but they're just not going to, and we need to get over that.
Yeah. What do you think then, like now we're kind of moving back to the philosophical aspect. What do you think about some of these discussions about being more, so like, let's like take away for a second these other scaling ideas, CAT and CTV. Like, let's just like say that Bitcoin is ossified now. I don't think this is the case, but let's say this Bitcoin is ossified now. How do you feel just ideologically about the sovereignty trade-offs? Like, are we making compromises? Because this is a big discussion, right? Like, people like you either own your UTXO or you're non-sovereign. And I think that maybe there's some, I don't want to speak for Bitcoin community, obviously, but like, I think there is some realization, at least with the current tooling, that there are going to be trade-offs, right? Like, there's these like eCash and some of the like custodial Lightning, like the wallet of Satoshi until it rugged US users was like quite popular, right? So like, how do you feel though about this sort of like compromise of like, you're sovereign on the L1, and then we start to make sort of some trade-offs? Like, where do you have any like lines in the sand that you draw? Like, we can't go beyond this, and or Bitcoin becomes useless, or is there? Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think ideologically, to distinguish it as clearly as possible from, commercially, what will we invest in? I do think it's a big problem. Again, I don't think I have anything particularly insightful to say on this. I think most of the conclusions I've come to personally are via Bitcoin Twitter, basically via, I don't mean like crowdsourcing, what the median view is. I mean, using Bitcoin Twitter to find people who I find trustworthy and compelling. But I do think it's a pretty big problem if, for lack of a better way of putting it, you don't, most people don't actually have sovereignty over whatever Bitcoin balance they have. There's a bunch of different directions that you can go in there. I mean, you alluded to some of them, even in earlier questions, whether it's like ARC or whether it's scaling with OpCat or scaling with some other kind of covenant. I'm not particularly qualified to opine on which of these is the best. But I think if we ossify now, or for the sake of argument, if it, we look back and it turns out we have in fact ossified now, that's really bad. Really, really bad. That's probably as much as I can intelligently say from at least from an ideological perspective, because it just feels like it defeats the purpose. I mean, you then, I won't go through all of this because your audience will be perfectly familiar with it, but you almost then reverse engineer the 6102 comparison, right? It's clearly inhibiting the requisite decentralization to actually avoid that, or to have any hope for avoiding that in the indefinitely long run. Like, it might feel fine now, but that's only because there's so few actual Bitcoiners. But the fact of there being so few actual Bitcoiners is testament to, that's back to the cliche of how early we are. And that only matters if in hindsight there ends up being many, many more, for which we definitely need superior scaling mechanisms than we have today. So yeah, I mean, purely ideologically, it's very, very bad.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm going back to monetary theory with you, because I think this is a good thing. Even though I know you don't want me to probe too much, but I think this is a little different question.
Just to be clear, it's not that I don't want you to. It's just that this stuff has been completely beaten to death. Like, probably everyone in the audience can just recite this in their sleep at this point.
I know, it's like just like pure laser-eyed maxi like podcaster talk. Yeah. But I do want to ask you, like, your vision of Bitcoin is one in which we supplant fiat entirely. That was the question. Sorry.
Oh, that's interesting. Maybe, yeah, I think my answer might be not what you expected and somewhat controversial. That I don't think you necessarily need to. I mean, that would be great as an outcome. But again, I think this is like an is-ought distinction, right? Ideologically, yes. Realistically, not necessarily. I find it quite easy to believe in scenarios in which we don't completely supplant fiat. And it could be something, just to throw something out there. I mean, there's so many options. You can possibly list all of them, but something like we return to a far more rigorous, disciplined, but I guess digitally upgraded version of the gold standard, right? Where it's like, it's the right. Bitcoin standard. And, maybe it's even, there is still fiat, but now it's eCash or something like that. I don't know if that's even really necessary to make this work, but that's almost like a cute little Bitcoinerism to throw into it. I think there's a quote that I always really like not a quote again. Sorry, I don't remember the exact wording of it, but it's a point that Saifedean made a long, long time ago. I want to say like 2017, 2018 or something, that by far the biggest threat to Bitcoin is just governments getting their shit together and having actually sound money, which is completely within their control or ability to do. They just don't do it for kind of obvious political reasons. Again, I don't need to give the whole explanation for that. Like, your audience knows this perfectly. But in light of Bitcoin's sufficient progress, maybe they do, because they finally wise up and they see the writing on the wall. And I kind of agree. Like, you go through the list of other potential longer term threats. None of them seem all that. I mean, there's ones that are just like completely unknowable, and that's fine. But of ones where you can actually map out exactly how that would, whatever it is, how that would happen, this one actually seems the most credible to me. And so that's why I think my answer isn't just cleanly like, yes, fiat's gone forever. I think the state will desperately cling to it, but on a longer time horizon, they'll need to adapt to the existence of Bitcoin. I think probably the best thing that you can, or not the best thing, the most encouraging thought you can have about this is that even if fiat does still exist, again, on a longer and longer time horizon, everyone will have the option of Bitcoin anyway, so its existence will matter less and less. And actually, maybe that's a great link to the previous question, which is that in order for that to be true, we need better scaling.
Yeah, I think that's like almost definitively the case.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to ask you, sorry, I'm really jumping around here, but
it's good fun.
So like, we've talked like sort of a little bit about what Axiom is wanting to do. How do you, in your mind, distinguish what Axiom wants to do versus, say, all these crypto VCs or Silicon Valley VCs in aggregate? Like where would you say that you differentiate on that spectrum?
So with crypto VCs, I mean, I think it should probably be clear. It depends exactly what you mean. So if by crypto VC, you just mean an actual venture investor, but that invests in the equity of companies involved in crypto, that's fine. I don't really have any kind of problem with that. I mean, I obviously disagree. Like, we're not going to do that. Like, that's not our thesis, but I don't really mind so much. It's just, you need investors to all have different investment theses, or else what's the point? Like, you may as well just have one, right? You may as well just have borderline communist capital allocation. Like, it's fine people having different theses. Obviously, the relevant distinction is how involved they are with token scams, which I see as so completely different to and removed from investing in actual companies. And I think that's one of the things that's really unfortunate about the crypto, again, I'm now doing air quotes, investment landscape. That if anything, I mostly just make fun of this, right? I just shitpost about it, as do you, by the way. Some of your shitposts on this topic are
very leading question here.
Yeah, are absolutely glorious. It doesn't really affect us much, but if I were, like a legitimate VC, let's say, who not even specialized in crypto necessarily, but just was involved in crypto, I would have thought that those people would be the most mad at pump and dumps and just like token bullshit in the first place, because it's surely delegitimizing what they're at least trying to do, honestly, even if obviously I think it's all a complete waste of time. So yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting distinction to make, that is worth drawing attention to. Silicon Valley, on the other hand, I shitpost about this quite a lot too.
Yeah.
I don't know how deep into this you want to get. Like, I have this whole theory about how Silicon Valley is just getting, it started off completely legit institution. Right. I mean, to the extent you think of it as a single institution, is kind of more like a metonym, I guess. But started off completely legit and has just become sillier and sillier. I think this is like a completely autistic Bitcoiner thing to say, but I think as a consequence of fiat, I honestly can't see any other way
I agree.
Of explaining it. I mean, I don't know how much detail you want me to go with that one, but
no, I mean, you've sort of hinted at this before, and I obviously troll a good bit about this. Like, as you said, a lot of innovation came out of Silicon Valley early, right? And it's undeniable, right? Yeah. And then we've sort of moved the goalposts on what is innovative and what is disruptive. And we have simultaneously moved the amount of money that's going into this stuff. So we're seeing increasing amounts of money into, I think you would probably consider this something like malinvestment. And this isn't exclusively crypto, so this is what's kind of interesting. It's I do think there are some intricacies to tokens. We would agree on that. I'll get flamed from whoever it is that listens to this, but I have my own thoughts about tokens as well, right? I think that they set up a dynamic that is, it's quite different than even just Silicon Valley, VCs in general. Usually they are exiting to other VCs or companies, or they're IPOing, right? And that, and tokens sort of, they almost set a lower bound on investments. You almost always have liquidity. And I don't know that this is a function of an efficient market when you can always exit and it's not really dependent on the success of the company, right? But yeah, I mean, I just, you can I love to hear your thoughts on this type of stuff. Obviously I anything that's contentious, but I mean, I've seen you troll. That's why I asked. I've seen you troll about the Silicon Valley dynamic. I mean, are we moving away from this, or is it just going to get sillier?
I think probably both, to be honest. It's just every other stupid thing in fiat, that it just becomes more and more consumed by short-termism, while the larger enterprises is dying, because you can only get so short-termist before you're not doing anything even remotely productive anymore. I think actually I wanted to pick up on something, because I wouldn't have mentioned this myself, I don't think, but you're drawing attention to liquidity. I think is particularly interesting. This is something that gets me really, really wound up. I'm not sure if I've done any shitposting on this in particular, because it's kind of a nuanced topic. I don't think it really lends itself well to a good dunking tweet. But the way people, certainly in crypto, it's completely egregious. But even in VC and even in TradFi as well, just to lesser and lesser degrees as you go down that spectrum, the way that they talk about liquidity, I think, typically betrays just a complete, I don't know if it's ignorance or if it's maybe apathy around capital accumulation. Essentially, back to one of the things I mentioned ages and ages ago, that liquidity ought to be a consequence of a well-functioning market, but not the goal. Like, to have it be the goal is kind of insane. I can't even think, like, I don't want to give too much of a straw man, but I almost can't articulate like what such a straw man would be. Like, where you think the point of investing is to be able to get out the investment as quickly as possible. Like, the goal should be to stay in the investment forever, basically.
Right.
Like, that should be your starting point. Like, when you make an investment, you never, ever get out of it. And then you can kind of work back from that. The more sophisticated the capital markets around this investment get, okay, maybe you have the opportunity to get out. And maybe that opportunity allows you to price this capital better. And maybe all of this, downstream is a good thing of the actual goal of making good investments. But when you start with wanting to no longer have the investment, the second after you made it, like, I don't even know what we're talking about anymore. I mean, it's pretty clear how you get from, real investing, I don't even know what else to call it, like actual investing, to pump and dump scams. Not to say, I think this is the tragic part, right? That most people who are in favor of this and do, favorably articulate it, probably aren't even deliberately promoting any kind of scam, whether specifically or just in general. But their attitude so easily lends itself to legitimizing scams that it's just really, really sad. And I think, if anything, one criticism you could make is that apathy and that kind of lack of intellectual seriousness about it almost sets the stage perfectly for all these scams that follow, because no one knows how to argue against it anymore, right? If the how do you even put this? If first of all, TradFi and then increasingly VC is getting all, jazzed up about liquidity, and then crypto comes along and gives you like instant liquidity all the time, like, nobody knows how to argue against it. It's like, oh, well, I mean, I guess that's good. Like, no, it's terrible. It's like completely delinquent. What are you talking about?
Thanks for listening to The Gort Show on the Blockspace Podcast Network. Subscribe to our newsletter at blockspace.media to get the show directly to your inbox. Show links, transcripts, and Bitcoin articles twice per week. Stay ahead of the conversation by visiting blockspace.media.
A lot of what I see in tokens is just like the desired outcomes with tokens don't really come into fruition. And so this is my like objection is, like this idea of, I was talking to somebody last week about this, like this idea of decentralizing these applications and protocols. Like, I don't think this really happens with tokens, right? They don't really grant very strong property rights or ownership rights. So there's another thing that's like, it's sort of nebulous. And then like maybe the most high level idea and why I still sort of contend with this is just, to me, the most valuable aspect of a blockchain, right? Like, now I'm just using the vague blockchain terminology. There's like, if the blockchain itself, if the blockchain itself can enforce the rights of the token, like, with Bitcoin, like, we have this large consensus set that ultimately enforces your ownership and validity of those tokens. And what I sort of object to, I would say, it's just like when you start adding in human decision making, like you were saying, right? Like in a smaller group of human decision making, it's like the blockchain can't really enforce these decisions that DAOs make. You know what I mean? They can enforce the ownership of the tokens, but it's I do sort of wonder about this. And like when everybody talks about putting all the assets in the world on the blockchain, is this really something that we want? I mean, maybe I could maybe be convinced, but
it's not something we want.
So would you say you have like a pretty strong aversion to tokens in general? Like, what about some of the stuff you're seeing on Bitcoin now? Like, what do you think of stablecoins and stablecoins with Bitcoin?
Cool.
Maybe.
All right, I'll come back to stablecoin. Remind me after this so we don't go too far off topic, because I have completely different thoughts on stablecoins. Just on tokens in general. So this will be my answer to this. I think will be like the closest I can come to getting cancelled. So good job for like baiting me into this. So completely in theory, I can imagine there being tokens that I don't object to, but they would have to have extremely specific criteria that I'm honestly not sure such a thing even exists. So to your question of like, how do I feel about them in general? Well, I don't think there is a specific answer, because literally everything I've ever seen in real life, I just think is ridiculous. So I think that's why it's worth, distinguishing between the theory and the practice. But in theory, I think it's good that we went through this before, because it's, I've kind of thrown enough concepts out to pick up on this pretty quickly. I wouldn't object to a token that was simply entitling its owner to the rights to cash flows that are entirely automatically generated, for which there is no human judgment involved. Maybe such a thing will exist at some point, and then I'll have to come back and, be okay with it and get cancelled, right? So but purely in theory, I think that's not, I was going to say not too objectionable. I'm not sure it's objectionable at all. I think that would be fine. It would be probably a bit unnerving for Bitcoiners, and also disappointing for crypto people, because it's like, wait a minute, we can't, there's nobody to scam with this. This actually works. But I think, the problem, this already, but just to round off a bunch of the concepts that we've covered, as soon as you introduce human decision making, as soon as you introduce, judgment influencing capital allocation, you have a principal agent problem. I want to be careful around tiptoeing around crypto anarchist sensibilities here, but I don't want to say you need legal investor protections, but practically everybody will expect that. And then you're into why are you using a blockchain at all? Because the whole point of using a blockchain, even saying that makes me cringe, because it's I'm immediately just my internal monologue is defaulting to why are you even using the word blockchain? It's only Bitcoin, blah blah blah. But again, I'll try to be super charitable. The reason that you would even in theory want to use a blockchain is the automatic enforcement. And so we're into this weird loop of none of these reasons actually making sense. They're all pointing to each other, but they never get resolved really. So I can't remember where I was even going with that, but there are in theory tokens that I wouldn't object to, but I don't know if they exist or ever will.
There is something like this on Ethereum. Actually, it's called Liquidity. I hate those. I have a whole, I don't know if you're setting me up on purpose. I had a massive go at them, kind of. They got involved, but it was actually someone else I was arguing with, that the design, I think, just makes absolutely no sense. I don't know if we even have time to get into this properly. I think algorithmic stablecoins are completely insane. Well, okay, this one is actually, I think Liquidity is it's over collateralized. Is that what you're talking about? It's over collateralized by Ethereum.
Yeah, it's over collateralized, but its selling point is that it's algorithmic, right? It's over collateralized, but it's still not, people making these decisions who can rug you. It's kind of, again, borderline cancelable. It's admirable. Its design is interesting. It's not, I'm not claiming it's a scam. I'm just claiming it's dumb. It's not the same thing, right?
Well, what do you think of what do you think of stablecoins in general? There's a lot of there's the camp of Bitcoiners who think that stablecoins are going to bring the state and take over Bitcoin. And then there's people who think that these are practical, necessary stepping stones, if you will. What are your thoughts on stablecoins as a whole?
I think I have a bunch of different thoughts. Again, there's a super relevant is-alt distinction here. I think this is kind of hard for a lot of Bitcoiners to swallow, but they're incredibly useful. People use them significantly, at massive, massive scale. And I can't see how you can really argue with that. I mean, you can kind of argue with it at the fringes, which I'm tempted to do, as a good Bitcoiner, right? that maybe some of it, but again, very mindful of the is-alt, that maybe you can tempt some of the people who are using them to incrementally save in Bitcoin and then eventually start transacting in Bitcoin as well. That'd be great, I guess. But, saying that they should want that, it just gets very muddy and unhelpful if you blur the distinction too much. There's another interesting angle you can take, I guess, around getting people used to the way these kinds of things work. If their starting point is purely fiat, moving to a blockchain,
right?
moving to a blockchain, and then kind of priming them for eventually not finding Bitcoin that weird and different. I think honestly, probably the most sensible view of stablecoins that to me ties all of this together is that I don't see them as having all that much to do with Bitcoin at all. I actually see them as basically being a subset of fintech, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Right,
It's like a novel
right.
payments technology, which is arguably better than fiat in a lot of ways, like traditional bank fiat.
Definitely.
In a lot of ways. I mean, probably the only way it's worse, or there may be two ways it's worse. So there's a lot of fiat payments which are architected to be free, and obviously no stablecoin quite achieves that. That's a very trivial criticism, I think. Probably the other one, though, is that one thing I'm a bit skeptical of is the risk of being rugged and how poorly articulated that often is. Not that it needs to be, like, obviously it's not really in anybody's interest who's involved in this to like flash these warnings up, but it does feel a bit like, especially when it's compared to like obviously degenerate crypto bullshit, it's like, oh, this is a safe option, right? It was like, well, it's the safe option until, you know, all your treasuries get yanked. And so I think there's still a pretty big question mark there around how credible the backing actually is to them. But even that is kind of I don't want to say it's trivial, but it's a separate realm of concern. I think I can say one more actually kind of critical thing that also ties it together nicely with how to compare it to Bitcoin, or rather to say that it just doesn't really have that much to do with Bitcoin at all, is it is around this whole point of the potential for being rugged, that it's once again, what it's representing is not enforceable on the blockchain. Right. It's kind of a dumb example of capital allocation, because it's like, we're going to allocate to one thing, but it is still a decision being made by humans because for different reasons. So I think this is a tricky thing. Humans are involved in the decision making because it's interfacing with a system that requires human involvement, right? You can't like own a treasury in a decentralized way. You need an actual account, right? You need like a means of facilitating interaction with the fiat banking system as a corporation in order to do this, assuming it's not, again, obviously there's a distinction with algorithmic stablecoins, which I think are stupid. So yeah, I think that's often that's not enough attention is drawn to, I mean, other than by Bitcoiners say this all the time, that like, this is still fiat. I think actually, okay, in summary, I've just been rambling for a while. In summary of all of this, right? Stablecoins have very little to do with Bitcoin. They're fiat, but they're better fiat. That's my conclusion.
Yeah, I said this recently, but I sent a wire transfer the other day, and oh
my god, it's so painful, isn't it?
Yeah, I sent a wire transfer to France, and it was unbelievable. Like, the bank I was using doesn't even interact with the bank over there, so I had to route it through like Wells Fargo. It was a disaster, and I mean,
yeah,
I in that process, I was like, this is very clearly disintermediated by stablecoins.
Yeah.
Stablecoins are still centralized. People want centralized stablecoins too. You know what I mean? Like there's and even, you know, on Ethereum and on these other, on Tron, like what they want is centralized stablecoins. They don't want to use decentralized stablecoins. And the reason that decentralized stablecoins
is perfectly sensible as well. I think there's yet again, there's a big is-ought here. Like, you can argue that people should want something else, but I don't know what you expect them to say to that. It's like, okay, but I don't, you know. I think, again, I'm glad I did all that thinking out loud in the ramble in the previous answer, because what I landed on is what I'm going to say from now on. It's, they're fiat, but they're better than fiat. They're like they're fiat 2.0, which still isn't as good as Bitcoin, but just has different use cases, at least for now.
Yeah. Okay. A couple other questions. You wrote this thing called DLCVM.
I forgot you were going to bring this up.
This was an elaborate troll. Let's hear about this.
So, well, I mean, do you want me to stay in
break it down, ramble.
No, but do you want me to acknowledge that it was a troll, or do you want me to pretend that it's like completely legit?
Well, I guess I've like sort of ruined the surprise here. So
you kind of outed me there.
Sorry about that. However you want to explain it. My bad.
Yeah. No, I think it's widely. It only lasted like a day or two because it was so ridiculous before people. Well, not before everybody caught on. I should say a lot of people caught on right away. I mean, there's a lot I can say. Do you want to ask a more specific question?
Okay, so what is DLCVM? What was the idea behind it?
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. So the idea behind it actually came from a really interesting discussion I was having with Salvatore Ingala, who is the guy behind the MAT proposal, so the Merkelize all the things. And I could probably look this up because it was in Telegram, so I could trace the exact history of all of this. But I think I was running this idea past him of, this is all very informal. This wasn't like a serious thing I was proposing. I was basically just abusing his time. I was kind of picking his brains around how little expressivity is, like, what's the minimum expressivity required to get basically everything you actually need, which is kind of the point of MAP, right? Like, that's how this conversation got going. And we're going back and forth with like pretty high level philosophical stuff. And I should look this up so I know exactly how the conversation went. But the core idea of what then became DLCVM, I literally just said as a joke, right? I was giving it as a kind of a reductio ad absurdum of how much you ought to be able to move off chain. Like, what it would be great if you could engineer to only be verified on chain, but the actual computation you do somewhere else. And we're going through all kinds of really old stuff that's now getting a lot of attention again, because this is why, like, the genesis of the conversation in the first place was all the BitVM stuff,
right?
And going back to, there's like various Greg Maxwell posts on this, and there's a Russell O'Connor talk on, or kind of vaguely around simplicity, but actually getting into some quite dense mathematical logic stuff from like 2017. We're like throwing all this around. I said, well, again, as completely as a joke, right? That the extreme of this line of argument, I don't even remember what argument I was making, unfortunately, but the extreme of it, if you just make it as stupid as possible, it's like, okay, well, you just do everything off chain and there's no connection whatsoever, other than you get an oracle to attest to the outcome of the computation, and then you plug that into a DLC, right? And so obviously in the first place, you set up the DLC to be like listening for this attestation. And then at the time, we're just like, ha, yes, that's so stupid. And then we just get the conversation going. But then a few days later, I came back to it and I was like, I bet I could convince people this is a good idea. Like, there was a couple of stages to how this then developed. It was like, the original idea was, if I package this in almost like a deliberately dumb but kind of hypey, basically, quintessentially crypto-y way, and maybe promise an ICO or something, I bet I could get people to believe it. That then got modified slightly when I started running it past other people, because we realized it would be a lot funnier. Because basically, like, if I, just knowing who I am, promote an ICO, people are going to be like, wait, there's something weird going on here. We decided it would be a lot funnier if we tweaked the framing slightly and put it forward as an actually serious, for Bitcoin technical proposal around scaling, right? And like lean into that part of my Twitter persona, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so then the idea about how to frame it all changed slightly, because it became less around like stupid, crypto-y, shilly hype, and more, it took on more of an element of like sort of classic hoaxes. I don't know if this will mean anything to people, but things like the Sokol hoax, for example, where I don't want to, people go look that up. I don't want to explain what that is now if you don't know already, but where the idea becomes more, how can I present this as pretentiously as possible with like an air of seriousness, such that the tone it alone convinces people it's real, even though if you can dissect it, you should be able to tell how stupid it is. But most people did. Well, I don't say most people, a lot of people didn't. They were like, whoa, Alan has solved scaling. That's fun.
Yeah, so I recommend everybody go read that. I think it's on your blog. It's called Uncerto. Yeah,
it's now a PDF on my site. Yeah.
So then I'll sort of, I don't know if this is a great question to end on, but I'll start to sort of ask you one other question to end on, like in this vein. Do you have like a vision for what, I know you've kind of mentioned that you sort of defer to the more technical people on a lot of this stuff, but I also think that you are becoming increasingly technically adept, or at least knowledgeable. I've noticed. Well, because
have I fooled you with DLCVM though? Is that
no, because
subconsciously influencing this?
No, I can tell that you're like digging more into the technical side, because I originally knew you as like sort of this Austrian monetarist with a strong vision for Bitcoin, and I can definitely tell with Axiom you've started to parse some of this stuff. But
I don't want to like pat myself on the back too much, because I still don't at all, hold myself this way. I wouldn't promote myself this way, but it's worth mentioning that I agree with, your characterization of that kind of gradual transition is just necessary, because I need to know when I'm being bullshit by people who want money from me. Right.
But so then, like, to that end, I mean, you guys invested in Alpin recently. Do you have like, I saw that was public, so I assumed it was okay to bring that up.
Totally. Yeah.
Like, so this is like a roll up, ZK. It's a, I don't know if they would, I think they would call themselves a roll up, but anyways, it's a ZK L2 right now. Okay. So, I mean, what are your, like, maybe we can, like sort of conclude with this. Like, what is your vision for, some of these scaling proposals? Like, are you keen on rollups, or you're still seem quite bullish on Lightning? What are you looking at in this vein?
I think I'm going to lean on a couple of things I've said previously and give a hilariously unhelpful non-answer.
That's okay.
I mean, you can probe, you can ask follow-ups to this if you want, but again, honestly, I don't think anybody should take seriously what I think about this, because Alpin's actually the perfect example of, because before when I brought this up, it was kind of in the abstract of us reacting to what we are presented with. Like, we didn't invest in Alpin because we were going around being like, who's doing a ZK roll up on Bitcoin? Like, that's not how it came about at all. And I think to drive that even a bit more deeply, I think it's, to the extent anybody even cares about like how maybe VC in general works, but in particular Bitcoin VCs, because this will go for a bunch of others that people know as well. It's important to appreciate that we don't invest in themes. Like, it's just not, it's kind of meaningless, right? We invest in businesses, like discrete businesses with real people running them who have actual experience and expertise and blah, blah, blah. And so the shape of our portfolio doesn't really necessarily mean anything at all beyond what opportunities we've been presented with. So like before, I said I tie in a bunch of the previous answers. I said that probably more than, not all, but more than half, say, of our portfolio has some connection to Lightning. We can maybe come back to that actually, because I meant to then go into, it's interesting that a lot of it doesn't, right? I think there's some cool examples there, and Alpin Labs is obviously one of them. But that's not at all because we're like, 60% bullish on Lightning, or that we think 60% of the future of Bitcoin is Lightning related. It's far more boringly than that. Of the opportunities we've seen, 60-ish% that we have wanted to invest in, again, crucially, as businesses, not as like protocols or ideas, even more intangibly, have had some Lightning component to it. So it's kind of like, if anything, I'm just sort of calming down the audience from. There's no like scandalous answer to this. It's just, we see what we see. We invest in what we think is appropriate. I don't want to claim any like bullshit thought leadership or anything stupid like that. It's, it depends what exists to be invested in the first place, depends the merits of the individual business.
Yeah. And it seems like actually to that end, Alpin has cultivated a very strong team. I mean,
that's a huge part of it.
Yeah. I was just interested to hear if you had any like hot takes on rollups, like this is obviously something that, some members of the Bitcoin community, the louder ones recently, have been really pushing. And I think it's just interesting because obviously this is playing out right now in Ethereum. And, there's like, you can kind of look at it from a number of different angles. Like they're having some success, and then there's other sort of roadblocks still. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts, like specifically on Rollups or other like of these like scaling solutions. Arc. I mean, we kind of talked about that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have some thoughts, but again, I'm going to try to be relatively, I don't know, disciplined in how I answer, because I just don't want to bullshit, right? Like I wouldn't want anybody listening to this to think that I have any particular expertise in this. Like I see what I see. I try to position myself such that I hear about all of these things to the advantage of my own business. So even there, that's probably worth mentioning too, that, obviously I'm massively incentivized to shill my own bag. So that's yet another reason to not take me particularly seriously on this.
Yeah, but I will say, just side note on that, I'll just say one thing. It's like when you are, I mean, for what it's worth, when you're investing in real companies, it is different than other scenarios of VC shilling their bags. Like it functionally is different, sure. Right? Like at the end of the day, like these companies, in order for you to see an ROI, they're going to have to build successful businesses, right? And I think this is like this is what a lot of Bitcoiners object to, and I'm like right in the middle of this, like following a lot of this stuff. But I mean, when you hear other VCs on podcasts, like you have to understand that like you investing out of Axiom, like there is a high probability you see no ROI on a number of your investments, right?
Oh,
like
absolutely. No, that's a really good point.
This is very different, right?
Yeah. I think especially as compared to Bitcoin itself, that's probably, if anything, unhelpful for people who haven't really fully thought this through, right? In some sense, I mean, obviously not to the wider world, but within the Bitcoin community, Bitcoin is like the surest thing there is. It's like, it is the risk-free asset, if you want to get kind of memey about it. Whereas obviously venture investments are almost definitionally the riskiest investments you can make. Now, my argument would be, this ties to something I mentioned right at the beginning. My argument would be that if you're willing to take on that risk profile, then also tethering it to Bitcoin in the way that we're trying to do with our portfolio is probably one of the wisest things you can do. But that still assumes a very specific kind of capital allocation, either mandate or just desire, potentially. It depends who, like we have, I don't want to go too far into this. It's not exactly what you asked, but we have different buckets of ideal clients that are looking for different things. And something that we try to, this is a good way of tying it all together though, something that we do our best to be, transparent about and honest about, is that it only really makes sense for us to think of Bitcoin itself as being our cost of capital, right? Because the opportunity cost, not so much for us, because we can't, like, we're structured to not be able to hold Bitcoin, largely for this reason, actually, but certainly for the clients, they can just go buy Bitcoin themselves.
Right.
And so where the kind of the philosophical justification for what we're doing in the first place is that the companies that we're investing in are, again, I wouldn't say quite definitionally, but it's relatively clear if you go through all the logical leaps that they're the most likely to outperform Bitcoin. For what I think is a pretty sensible reason, because like outperform Bitcoin sounds like kind of scandalous. It's not that they're like some crypto pump and dump that's like, it's just beta to Bitcoin, it's just going up forever. It's a far more kind of mundane reason, which is that these are going to be the first companies to themselves get on a Bitcoin standard. Like if they're the ones who are pushing the existence or the feasibility of a Bitcoin standard at all, then they're surely going to be the first ones to get on it. And at that point, if they're profitable at all, right, if they're generating any kind of return, they're definitionally outperforming Bitcoin. And so that's the thesis that we're putting out to our potential clients. However, that only really makes sense at a portfolio level. It certainly doesn't make sense on the this is going right back to your question. For every individual company, we certainly do not say, it's guaranteed to outperform Bitcoin, right? It's because because again, they're venture investments. They're extremely high risk on an individual basis, especially, I mean, I don't want to throw like Sims and the whole crew under the bus, but I don't want to say that Alpin is riskier, but Alpin, of everything we've invested in, is probably one of the more speculative, right? It's very out there in terms of R&D centric. It's pre-product, right? It's like, it's way out on the risk curve. So yeah, it's not at all representative of you. I don't think there's any coherent argument to make around like, oh, why would you invest in Alpine? You can just buy Bitcoin. Like maybe at a portfolio level there is, and so that's our job to try to articulate that to whoever our clients are going to be. But yeah, on a kind of a case by case basis with individual highly speculative companies, it doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah. Okay, I actually had one follow up to that. It seems like the Bitcoin community is generally more receptive now to VCs, I would say, and I think this is in large part because of sort of the cultural shakeup we've seen over the past year or two, right? Like I think there is more of an understanding of VCs entering the space now. Like that's going to be, we're going to see a lot of VCs doing similar, kind of shenanigans that we see in crypto. But would you agree that like the sentiment has generally changed and people are like coming to right this for so long? We had this kind of like laser eyed, like if you're not just buying Bitcoin and putting it in your cold card, like you're scamming, and then now in reality, I think that people are finally coming around to this idea that like, look, like these companies that you want to facilitate a Bitcoin standard or whatever the laser eyes want, right? Like they need capital and they need like structure and yeah, I think would you agree that like there's been more of a okay, like I get it now. We have to build real businesses to facilitate, this Bitcoin standard that we dream of.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's probably worth saying that I am very sensitive to that critique. I think it's kind of obvious where it comes from as well. I don't think it's really, it comes across as ideological. I think you could even say there's an important ideological component to it, but I think it originates in kind of learned horrific experience.
Exactly.
In that the only exposure most Bitcoiners have had to VCs for most of their own involvement has been exactly like crypto pump and dumps. So, I mean, I would say that to the extent it's true that the sentiment has kind of shifted, it's probably only because there are now Bitcoin only companies that are doing pretty well, right? That are, and that by necessity have taken on VC investment. And I think it's worth crediting because like Axiom itself it's now, well, it depends on when you want to start counting it, but we were only deploying from the venture fund not even a year ago. There's other people it's definitely worth crediting, like Elise Colleen at Stillmark has basically invented this category and is amazing. 1031 guys have been doing it for a long time. I remember I've told them this directly that one of the inspirations for Axiom was me hearing them on TFTC when they were announcing that, because I forget the exact history, but I think that they were doing it in stealth for a while. And then they obviously at some point decided they wanted to announce it and try to get some publicity. But just the way they explained it on the podcast, I remember listening, like I distinctly remember the entire experience. I remember where I was and what I was doing when I was listening to this, and still in my TradFi job though, right? And just thinking like, oh my God, that actually all makes sense. Like maybe you can do this. Maybe this is like a real job that somebody should have. So I think there's been a lot of good work done by people well before me. I mean, my point is I'm like not trying to take any credit for this whatsoever because we're relatively newer to the scene. But in terms of legitimizing what the role of investors ought to be in the ecosystem. And if anything, it's one of these weird that like this, I find this comes up a lot in Bitcoin in various different guises where it's not even that this is good, essentially, is that this is just like normal. This is what you would expect for a burgeoning industry, especially one that's so software focused.
Right.
It's more that there's been like a period of just really bad. I'm not being particularly articulate in describing this, but like, it's not that this is good, this is normal, but it's only now starting to counter and overcome, as much psychologically as actually on the ground, all of the horrible experiences that people had come to associate with VC for most of the history of their involvement. Yeah.
Oh, okay. One last question, actually. Easy one. Do you like the NFTs? Do you like Ordinals? Are you allowed to comment?
Yeah, no, I'm perfectly allowed to comment. I just kind of don't care, to be honest. I don't really have an interesting answer to this. Like, Yeah, I just don't really, I'm not all that interested. I'm not dismissive either. Like, it seems pretty obvious at this point it's not going to go away. I mean, at least not until it is completely priced out, probably by L2s, you'd have to think. But who knows how long that's going to take. I think honestly, my reaction to this is as much from the perspective of my job as anything else, that I haven't seen anything ordinal related worth investing in. I think that there is an interesting distinction here, that for a long time the Bitcoiner reaction was, oh, this is just all a scam, right?
Right.
Which I think actually at the time was reasonable. It seems like it's probably been proven wrong. I mean, that's maybe a bit contentious as well, but in the sense of like, if you think it's a scam, it's therefore obviously unsustainable and therefore it'll go away, but it hasn't gone away. So maybe you have to think about it a bit more seriously now. However, that's on the just the level of like the tech itself.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anything investable that seems remotely sustainable. Like it's very, at least what's come about so far has been very hype driven.
Yeah.
And kind of assumes that initial hype will just never ever go away. Which is, I think, it just doesn't interest me. That's kind of where I come out on all this. It's like, I've thought about it a lot and I kind of just don't care anymore.
Yeah, I think it has certainly brought people back to Bitcoin. Like, I think it's pretty much undeniable. And I think it has brought people who had left Bitcoin and are now interested again. I think it's a scam, but it's kind of like our scam. Like, I know no, I mean, it's kind of like endearing in a sense. And you know what? I talked to Rindale, or I still don't know how to say his name, Rindale, whatever his name is. I talked to him about this, and he said, like, his comparison was like Bitcoin is digital gold and NFTs are digital jewelry. And like jewelry is like
that's good.
Is like a kind of like a vapid, like materialistic thing, but it's like it's our little scam again, you know.
I tell you what, right? I'll give you a more contentious answer. Right? I just realized that like what I said there was kind of tame relative to what you were going for. So okay, completely with my VC hat off, more my Bitcoin Twitter hat on. This is a juicy take, right? Everybody's wrong about this, and I'm making this more meme worthy than maybe I truly believe, but I think I do genuinely believe the core of this, right? So what I mean by everybody's wrong is assuming that there's basically two camps to this, which is probably not really true anyway. But there's like the fix the filters people. And then, well, actually, there's probably three because there's a large, more or less indifferent group, which truthfully I'm in. But, the one end is like the fixed filters people. And then the other, the degenerate NFTers, just kind of arguing back and forth with each other. And then the people in the middle who don't really care are just like confused by the whole thing. But I kind of think that both of them are wrong in their own way. So I think the people who are arguing, and maybe some of the people who are indifferent do actually kind of fall in this camp, but certainly the more degenerate NFT pushers certainly do. I've noticed there's this weird aversion to describing it as spam, and not even just a weird aversion. Actually, I can be more specific. I find a lot of the argumentation from that camp to be really confusing and basically just inaccurate, but for kind of, I don't want to sound too pretentious, but almost philosophical reasons. It's like they're making like weird category errors in what they're saying. Like, to my mind, it clearly is spam, but their argument tends to be, I don't mean to straw man it. I think they would say something like, well, it's paying the fees, and who are we to try to censor this? Like, there's no way to, there's no way to cut it out that wouldn't amount to a general ability to censor. And so if we're really free market absolutists, we have to tolerate this. And I find that that's like a really weird conflation of concepts, because that can all be true and it can still be spam. Like, spam is because another thing that they tend to say is that spam is subjective, right? Which, yes, is true. And I subjectively think that this is spam. And so do you, if you're being honest. So that's on the one hand, like, they're wrong about that. But they are right, as far as I can tell, at least, that you probably can't stop it, at least without doing way more damage than you intend to. And so that's where I think the fix the filters people are potentially wrong. I mean, I don't really want to get into the weeds about like what fixing the filters would even do, if anything. But it feels to me like they're right about it being spam. Kind of obviously, that's like the starting point of their argument. But that they're wrong about, therefore what? Like, what do we do as a result of this being spam? So that's the hot take that you were looking for after my initially kind of boring answer. Like, everybody's wrong.
Yeah, I would say one thing, and maybe you can object to this or think about it and then come back and object to this. But I think one thing, and this kind of goes to the point I was making earlier about like, okay, so what do we actually need a blockchain for, right? Like, and ideally it's that a large, like decentralized, varying incentive-based consensus validates the rules. And that is the only group that validates the rules. And so with these NFTs, like I just call them NFTs, like just NFTs on Bitcoin. I think that they do. So you have to like, if you want to be like truly self-sovereign with your ordinal, you need to run like this indexer and like this meta protocol, blah, blah, blah. It also has, it's like massive storage constraints, which is kind of funny. Like it nobody actually runs these things to my knowledge. Like I was reading, I don't know, maybe this is different now. And there will be like solutions ultimately to this, but like, I do think that digital art conveys pretty strong property rights compared to like a DAO token. Like it's pretty obvious what you're getting and it's pretty straightforward. And like one thing I've felt about NFTs is like a lot of them, I mean, there's like NFTs where like some creator launches it and makes like, what did Beeple make? Beeple made like some outrageous amount of money.
Oh yeah, it was like 17 million or something. It was like clearly money laundering, but anyway.
And it's like, okay, like we can talk about like how much free floating fiat is in this system that creates this like incestuous dynamic where people can just make outrageous amounts of money, right? But like I did come around to the notion that like mostly, first of all, I'm like, we can't like be overly sympathetic if we believe in capitalism towards these people, right? Like they're choosing to participate in this. But also I think that it's fairly straightforward what they're getting. Like, and I mean, I think Rindell like articulated this pretty well. It's like, look, like we sell these pictures of cats and we're going to take that money and we're going to go develop stuff. Now, what they end up developing, we'll see, right? But like people know what they're getting. And I think it's about as close, like outside of like Bitcoin, the asset, or even just like, like ETH, the asset on Ethereum versus like all the other tokens, right? Like in terms of its nativity on the chain, NFTs are pretty close to being like strong property rights and like fairly obvious. Like you are getting a JPEG, like that's what you're getting. So I don't know. I like it. The problem with a lot of these things, at least now I'm rambling, but like the problem with a lot of these things, I think is like it's hard sometimes to like rationalize whether or not all of this scammery like is justified. Even if the end game, like I think because a lot of crypto, the way that I see it is like the ends justify the means, right? Like we were trying all this stuff, like we're gonna move fast, break things, and we'll see what works. But like sometimes what happens is like a lot of us maybe are like, well, what are the ends? Because it seems like the ends are oftentimes just like to facilitate more means. It's like this circular thing where it's just like there's like this insatiable desire to gamble on stuff. And so it's just like this self-perpetuating cycle. But anyways, that was like a digression on my part. But I do think that, I don't know, I think that the NFT, I have come around to the NFTs maybe more than a lot of the rest of this stuff. So I don't know. Well, any closing thoughts?
I have loads I want to say to that. We can't end now.
Go, run it.
Okay.
Keep rambling.
No, I think I've got at least 3 responses to this. So number one is that I very clearly remember when I had this realization, like where I was, what was happening, etc. Maybe a year or 2 ago, I had this realization that almost helped me kind of come to peace. It wasn't anything to do with Ordinals. It was more like crypto, and come to peace with basically why it exists. I think you were kind of getting at this. I know your comments were more about Ordinals specifically, but I think you'll agree with me in extrapolating it to things that are obviously even more degenerate. Because I think a lot of Bitcoiners have this, including old me, by the way, that's like why this is so interesting, have this kind of crisis around being mad that they're getting away with it, right? It's like, this is so, surely it will stop purely because it's stupid. And it never stops. And you're like, then you just go nuts. And my realization that spared me from this and allowed me to almost get this kind of Zen-like calm about the whole thing was realizing that it's just gambling, right? And I then went and looked this up because I put it in various like talks and things that the gambling industry globally is, I mean, at least what's, legal and known. So it might even be like orders of magnitude bigger than this for all I know, but it's thought to be something like an $800 billion industry annually.
Yes.
So it's huge and it's very real. And most of it is, like legit. It's in the sense of, being not obviously, it's consensual, let's say, right? I don't want to kind of tiptoe. You can say it's unethical, right? But it's at least consensual. You can't really argue with that. And that figure is from what's legal as well. Again, not that you should take that too seriously, but it's a real industry. I think that's probably the most important point, right? Like this is real economic activity that's absolutely massive. Like it's way bigger than crypto and Bitcoin combined.
Yeah.
And so once first of all, you come to terms with that. And yeah, you can think it's unethical. You can even think it's stupid, but it exists. And to my mind, most of what crypto is doing fits in there, particularly the bits that are like annoyingly stupid. They're kind of not in this roundabout way, but I think more importantly, they won't end because they're just gambling. I don't know if that necessarily applies to ordinals or not, but you seem like you agree with this analysis. So that's good.
I was just like, sorry, I don't know what subject you're going to move on to, but I just wanted to like point out, like, this has long been almost exactly my same thesis. It's like, the thing is if you look at this as a casino, you realize that casinos have existed for hundreds of years and they can persist. I think, and that's fine. Like, I think the objection, well, there's a number of objections, like with crypto, maybe if you have them. And I also have come to terms with this and I kind of just comment on the sidelines, but I think that maybe the objection is, and I made this joke one time on Twitter. I posted, I said, crypto people walk into a casino and point at a slot machine and say, that's the future of finance. Right?
I remember that one. Yeah.
And so like, I think this is the chasm that a lot of Bitcoiners also can't cross, and reasonably so, right? Is like, it's fine if you want to do all this stuff. And in many ways, like, look, I'm a degenerate myself. Like I'm in the trenches a lot of times, right? But I also don't point at this stuff and say, oh, like this is clearly the future of finance. And in a sense, what I think is interesting is like,
it's the future of gambling. It's
well, exactly. Like, yeah. And I mean, the thing is like, there is some, I'm not going to say path dependency, but I can't think of a better word. Like, if you build these systems out and continue this way, you sort of have to characterize them as a casino in a sense, because like casinos aren't efficient markets in the sense that like people in casinos know they go in and lose, like, depending on the game they play, like 1 to 10% over a long enough time frame, right? Like their expected value is negative 10% over however many hands or bets they make. And so I think like this is probably like the difference where I just maybe object to like looking at these things and saying like, oh, like this is how capital is efficiently allocated, when in reality, like all we've had are like, if 99% of people who are engaging with this stuff are degenerate gamblers, then like, and I'm not saying like, maybe that's harsh, right? But like, let's just say that most of this is hoping to try to turn more tokens into more tokens. It's like, it's a little bit presumptuous of us maybe to assume that like, this is the way you effectively allocate capital, So that would be like, that's sort of like how I look at this. But anyways, go on.
Well, that was point one on gambling. I don't know if you want to tease that out any further, because I remember there was a couple of things I wanted to say in response. So, what was the next one? Oh yeah. So if anybody in the audience hasn't read it, Casey has a very good, pretty short blog post on all of this. Yeah. I forget what it's called, but it's something like, or if this isn't the title, it's like a good summary of it. Like, what should you as a maxi do about ordinals? And the answer is basically just like, calm down, it's fine. Right. And I mean, I won't go through I don't remember it in amazing detail, but I remember like not disagreeing with any of it and thinking it was all pretty sensible. So that's another thing. People go read that. And then, I think the final thing I wanted to say, there's some overlap here with stuff that's in that blog anyway, but there are a lot of bad arguments against ordinals. I think that's a thing that it's actually kind of unfortunate from the point of view of people who maybe want to forcefully make the argument that it's spam, which, as I said before, I agree with. I don't think anything necessarily follows from that. But if you want to make that argument and you want to convince people, but you then also say things like, I think probably the one that bugs me the most is, and the reason I thought of this is because you alluded to it in your answer previously. Oh, it's all just made up. Like people, there's no real truth. Again, I'm struggling because I don't want to straw man this, but I think this is actually, more or less what these people will say. There's no real truth here. This is all just like a social, I don't know, delusion or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is just, it's such a bad argument for at least two reasons I can think of, probably even more, that maybe you can think of your own responses to it. So one is that there's absolutely nothing you can say in that vein that isn't also true of Bitcoin, which is problematic.
Subjective value.
Yeah. If you're, if you're making this point as an allegedly hardcore, laser eye for the sake of it, Bitcoiner, which I say affectionately, by the way, because I have laser eyes, so I'm a laser eye maxi. I want to come back to that actually. That's a good note to end on because I have a good point to make about that too. So that's one, is that it all applies to Bitcoin too. Maybe the even stronger one though is that, and I think Casey mentions this, they all know that, like, it's so condescending that you're not, because again, if you're just venting, I guess it's fine. But if you're saying this in order to try to convince people of your position that, for example, it's spam, which I agree with, but you're also telling them they're like basically retarded and they don't know what they're doing, and that, they're reading your argument or listening to it, say, they're just like, but no, I know that. Like, of course I know that. Like, what are you even trying to convince me of here? That I'm an idiot? Great. Yeah. Thanks. So I think, do you want to finish on the laser eye thing?
Yeah. Go for it.
This is another good spicy take. You can, post this in isolation. So, I've only really started to notice this recently, although I think it's probably been true for a long time, that saying laser eye maxi, or using laser eye just, as an adjective, but as an insult, is a really peculiar thing to do, given that most of the people, maybe all of them actually, I'm not sure, but certainly most of the people who I see doing this at one point had laser eyes.
Yeah.
And I actually find this really funny, because if it was like some fiat maxi doing it, some like econ professor or something, or like somebody who works at the Fed making fun of laser eye maxis, like that would be kind of legit. But when it's someone who used to have laser eyes and now doesn't, and is now making fun of it, honestly, all I can think is like, you're just basically a fair weather fan. Like, you'll go with whatever the current thing is. And if the current thing turns against a previous current thing, you're totally fine with that contradiction. Whereas I put on laser eyes because, well, I really did it because everyone else was doing it, just to be completely honest about that. But at least nominally, I did it because that's how we were going to get to 100K, right? And we haven't got to 100K. So why is anybody taking them off? Like, I think this is a very good question that these people need to answer. Why did you, or maybe digging a little deeper, like, why did you put them on in the first place? Like, that's the real root of this. So just because I had an opportunity to bring that up, I wanted to vent a little bit about that. I am not taking them off until we get to 100K, and I'm probably still not going to take them off then.
Yeah, I definitely use laser eyed maxi as a as a term of condescension, but also it's less condescending in my eyes. It's just like a way to categorize a belief set. And like Udi and Eric have kind of run with this, and I don't really have much of an objection to it, but it's just easy to classify people that way. But I definitely respect your conviction and commitment to it. I don't personally have laser eyes, but I do respect people who like take a stand and run with it. Okay, Alan, thank you so much. I thought it was an awesome conversation. We really jumped around a lot, but this is like very typical of the podcast I do. So where can people find you? Tell people to read all your blog posts. I've really quite enjoyed them. And I know you have both stuff on Axiom's website now and on your own personal blog. And then obviously you're on Twitter. So if you want to just tell people where to find you, it'd be awesome.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to throw people like down too many different rabbit holes. My own Twitter is where most of this stuff is coordinated. Just to explain that distinction, though, so since we went public with Axiom, which is like nearly a year ago, that's where I now do most of my writing. I've pulled back a lot from the stuff that I would otherwise be posting on Medium, just because I only have so much time. But it's quite a different flavor. So it's almost like a disclaimer that I don't necessarily expect people to enjoy it, or maybe they enjoy one but not the other. The Axiom stuff is quite dense. It's quite dry. But what it's basically imitating in an attempt to kind of grab a certain audience who wouldn't otherwise be reading Bitcoin stuff is the tone of sell-side research in TradFi.
Yep.
If people don't know, I don't want to explain this in too much detail, but basically research that investment banks put out typically on companies, sometimes on like asset classes, if it's, commodities or some other investable thing, to encourage institutional clients to consider investing in whatever it is. So it's not like we've just written a Bitcoin report. What we're talking about is more specific topics within Bitcoin. But the tone and the style is very deliberately in that vein, because we want to pump this stuff into TradFi. And ultimately, entirely selfishly, we would just want to get these people as clients. But, hopefully there's a more kind of altruistic side effects of this, which is that we orange pill the occasional banker. Whereas all my Medium stuff is a lot more kind of lighthearted and shitposty. But anyway, so it all goes through Twitter anyway. So handle there is just ALLENF32. Alan F32.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I thought it was awesome.
No, thank you so much for having me. Great chat.